Presidential Climate Commission has provided clear inputs and guidance into the contested space of South Africa's electricity planning and management. That's a view of the Worldwide Fund for Nature. It says the recommendations are sober balance of fiscal, social and environmental responsibility. James Reller is the Senior Manager for Climate Action at WWF South Africa and says this reflects the global imperative to remove dirty fossil fuels from our electricity mix. And Reller joins us now virtually from Cape Town, and behind him showing off a picture of one of the beautiful green buildings in South Africa, ones that we need more of. James, thank you so much for your time this morning. We don't often get to talk about positive news, but this really, this Presidential Climate Commission and what news has come out of it recently, really is a step in the right direction, isn't it?
Absolutely. I think the Presidential Commission has done a very good job of consulting quite broadly and really looking at the technical inputs to provide this guidance. And I think overall, one can only say, generally that consultation processes for South Africa, should be this good. And really the guidance gives the Presidential Commission itself is not the entity who's responsible for rolling this out, but it does give a good sense of what we can do to firstly address the near-term electricity problems, but actually in that process to, in the long term, really move South Africa towards a greener, a more healthy, less impactful energy system that can only benefit us developmentally.
You speak specifically there about this consultative process, and we know in South Africa we've had many of these. Tell us what was different about this. I would think that if you're speaking so positively about your experience, it means that you actually felt heard and seen in the process, and not just as an add-on or it looks good on paper to have all these organizations there, but we're actually just going to steamroll with our own ideas going forward. Tell us about that process.
I think that's a fair assessment often of a lot of consultative processes. What we can say about this is that, no process is ever without flaws, but the Presidential Commission has really had a very good open platform that's been available to anybody. They've done roadshows, they've gone to key stakeholders and key places within the country in a number of the provinces. And they've also reached out to different groupings to make sure that they're hearing the voices of civil society, of business, of sort of the technical experts, and really to try and make sure that those inputs to the commissioners and to the commission itself are really heard. And that is reflected largely in the outputs of the commission.
In other parts of the world, they probably are going through this process with a 5-year plan, a 10-year plan, and a 20-year plan. But in South Africa, we're sitting with a situation where the urgency of getting this mix right is as urgent as will we be able to switch on the lights next week or not? And can we bring down the amount of load shedding? And how does that look like for the next year, let alone 5 years, 10 years' time? Do you feel that urgency in these rooms, these boardrooms, these Zoom meetings that you've had? And do you get the feeling that finally we're actually going to see some action?
Absolutely. So we've also, consulted with the Presidential Crisis Committee on this. But the Presidential Climate Commission's recommendations are very specifically talking about that urgency. And we're all obviously familiar with the situation. But the reality is that if we want to address the shortfall in the near term, the problem of the energy availability factor, of our coal plants is not going away. We can hope to get them up to 60%, but they're very aging. They do need to be retired. So the quickest way to fill that gap in the near term is really to build as fast as we can renewable energy. And if you think about it, that does make sense. Every single solar panel that gets built can immediately put its electricity into the grid, as opposed to 10 years or longer to commission something like a coal plant, up to 15 years for nuclear. So just in terms of the crisis, it makes sense to focus very much in the near term on renewable energy. And the concerns that people express about the variability of renewable energy, which is understandable. The wind doesn't blow all the time, the sun doesn't shine all the time, but they're actually very readily addressed by just the co-location. That means putting in the same place storage. So batteries, we have pumped storage in Cape Town, which is already saving the city from one sort of stage of load shedding. But you can very readily level, particularly for these low levels of penetration, that gap. And so it doesn't actually affect the availability. It can still be available 24/7. And in the long term, even high levels of renewable penetration, Denmark's up to 67% and is still running a very stable grid. So the near-term planning makes sense, but it is also a vision for the long term. And it's critical that South Africa decarbonize, or we won't be able to access international markets with our products because of carbon taxes internationally. And obviously, we need to address our developmental needs. We need that energy to conduct the social upliftment that really is the promise of our developmental state.
Yeah, absolutely, because the last thing we need is for this to be another sector where it widens the gap between the haves and the have-nots. Already you're seeing solar panels going up almost like a tsunami through the leafy suburbs of places like Joburg and Cape Town. And the last thing we need is for that again to become a growing gap of inequality in South Africa. Just one final question from me. How important now is the communication of what has been decided at this very high level of the Presidential Climate Commission, and how that information is trickled down to the public? Because, you know, before, the need for renewable energy, I would think it's almost like this generation of adults who think about it as something that kids are learning about at school, but it's something that we won't be around to see and that kind of thing. But we're having to come to grips with it right now, aren't we? Do you think there's enough of a plan, and how important is it for that narrative to trickle down and for that information and education to trickle down to all ordinary South Africans?
I can't speak to the availability of a plan. I do know that the Presidential Commission has been doing a lot of communication. But I think more broadly, there are a number of myths about renewable energy that need to be bust. And it must be said that whatever we do, we're developing a new power sort of electricity sector. Either we're, going the renewable route and we're building it out, or we have to rebuild everything in any case. So it is going to happen. But I think the common understanding of the challenges of renewable energy are very simplistic, and that does need to be addressed. It is it is in fact now the cheapest electricity available to humanity ever. And even when you factor in the necessity for additional peaking, that means sort of filling the gaps. And when we have huge demands to bring on rapidly additional energy, even that additional cost still comes in as the lowest cost available option for us to address it. But that's not the common understanding. Those rapid drops in price that have happened historically are kind of unprecedented. And so, we need to be clear about the new paradigm that we're living in, about that essentially this is the best option available, not just for addressing our electricity crisis, but actually for long-term addressing climate change and human health needs.
Okay, we're going to leave it there. Thank you so much for that insight there. That's James Reller, the Senior Manager for Climate Action at the WWF South Africa. We thank him for his time this morning.